Thanks for joining us on Not Boring CEs, where we don't think you should be bored to death while getting your continuing ed. Keep listening here, then hop over to notboringces.com to get all your online CE credits. All right, y'all, let's get to learning. Courtney Katzenberg started clinical work in January 2021 after a career transition from the field of education that left her seeking an internship that could provide the opportunity to employ evidence-based, compassionate, and mindfulness-focused modalities with the perinatal population. She found a wonderful home at B.Psychotherapy in Baltimore, Maryland, and is now a full-time therapist. She has expanded her work to all individuals and couples looking to live with more compassion and authenticity. Courtney's specialties include chronic stress and burnout with work, parenting, or perfectionism, shame and self-criticism, and couples working toward more thoughtful and compassionate communication. Welcome back to Not Boring CEs. I'm here with Courtney Katzenberg, and we are talking about compassion-focused therapy. So thanks for being here, Courtney.
Absolutely. I am very excited to be here and share CFT.
Yeah. So can you kind of let's go super basic. Can you
Yes,
tell us, let's start with self-compassion
sure.
in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm going to share kind of so coming from a CFT lens, kind of looking at compassion and kind of getting into, I can share about the flows of compassion. But so self-compassion is compassion for self is one of the flows. But so like the overall definition would be a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others and a commitment to relieve and prevent it. So that's a lot, but it's this idea that one, we're going to engage with our suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, we're going to take intentional steps to prevent it. And so it's not just like this problem solving, let's just solve the problem. It's like, wait, let's slow down. And what is the actual suffering that's going on? What is the distress? And so we can think of it both for ourselves and then the flows of compassion to others. And often we're really good at for others. It's right that how do we then turn to our own distress and first know what it is, so then we can be intentional about how we prevent it and alleviate it.
Yeah. So I think about the other self stuff. Like there's self-esteem, there's self-indulgence. Like how
Uh-huh.
do we differentiate self-compassion from self-esteem, for instance?
Absolutely. And it's funny because I did my master's thesis. I wanted to do it on parenting. And my mentor was like, I think what you're talking about is like self-compassion in parenting. And I was like, no, 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 no. That is not what I'm talking about. Underneath was this fear of like, I don't know what that is. So how
Mm-hmm.
can I do a whole research paper on self-compassion? So then I was like, I think I'm really talking about self-esteem. What I did is I actually took Rosenberg's self-esteem scale and I altered it for parents. And I had a little focus group of moms and gave them this scale of the Rosenberg self-esteem scale for parents that I had kind of created. And they were like, I hate this because it's about comparison and competition. And so, of course, I had cleaned up my living room because I'm having people over, so it looks spotless. And one of the questions is kind of like, I am as good as other parents. And they're sitting in my spotless living room because I have made it spotless. And they're like,
Mm-hmm.
well, my living room doesn't look like this. And so it inherently creates this comparison and competition, which just we're always then one up or one down. And so self-compassion says there's more than one way to be. Like, am I doing for myself? Where is my distress? As opposed to where is my distress compared to someone else's? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's where self-compassion is kind of that looking inward as opposed to the looking out and comparing. And then, so then I went back to my mentor and I said, I hated self-esteem. And he's like, he knew. And he's like, okay, self-compassion. Went back with the self-compassion scale and they're like, oh, okay, this feels good. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think about a lot of my clientele that I've had over the last couple decades. The idea of self-compassion feels indulgent. It feels like I'm letting myself off the hook and I
Yeah.
really need to punish myself more and things like that. So how do we differentiate it from this self-indulgence, both maybe from like a definition standpoint, but also like how do we talk to our clients about how like
Yeah.
this is actually different from like letting yourself off the hook, quote unquote, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And self-indulgence is almost avoidance, I think.
Hmm.
Like if I just indulge myself, I'm actually not encountering my distress. And that's where self-compassion is. It's not, it is tough. It's hard because you have to be brave and face like, oh, this is actually what's upsetting me. And so it can be hard. I often think of it, I talk about it like it's a coach. The ideal coach is a compassionate coach. You know, you have a tough game. The next day you show up and a harsh coach would say, that was terrible. I can't believe that. You need to do all these things because, basically you're the worst team ever. But actually, what if it was just communication or what if it was passing? Doing all these other things is not actually getting to the root. A self-indulgent coach might say, you know what, we shouldn't even have practice today. It was a tough day. But again, that's not helping you be better. It's not helping you be accountable. So the compassionate coach says, like, that was a really tough game, wasn't it? Like, you probably don't feel really great right now, but we can show up today. We can support each other, which is then the next time you step on the field, going to make you feel that much more prepared. Where if you didn't practice, you're not going to feel prepared. And if you had all this shame put on you, you're going to go and show up on the field with fear. Well, I can't do that again, but not really ready to like put it all out there.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So I feel like that's like very actionable in session. Absolutely.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah.
So, like CFT is its own modality,
It
right?
is.
It's
Yes.
so kind of break down the core principles of CFT for us.
Yeah, yeah. So see, and the kind of a little background is that Paul Gilbert developed it. He knew CBT really well. And so he was doing all this cognitive restructuring. He was, using those tools, but finding that clients weren't were still struggling. And he's like, they know what to say, but where is the mismatch? And so he one time had he shares this in a wonderful, he's on a the 10% Happier podcast, and so he
Hmm.
shared a story where he just tried to have the client say, like, just share with me, like, what is going through your head right now. And so, like, I can't exactly the exact words, but like, for example, like the phrase, like, everyone goes through this. Well, you could also say it, everyone goes through this, and like,
Hmm.
as kind of shame. And so it's also like, how are we talking to ourselves? How are we using compassion, not just the words, but like a whole kind of tone of voice, thought thinking. And so that was kind of where he was like, okay, we really need to build up this compassion. It's not just about the thoughts and behaviors, it's how do we motivate ourselves to actually keep going and with compassion. So that's just a little background I like to share to
Yeah.
help understand. So CFT, the core principles is one that we have more than three systems, but for like emotion regulation, but kind of the three main that we focus on is the threat system, which is very much our protection, those connected to anxiety and fear and anger. We have our drive system, achievement, motivation, pursuing. And then we have
Sorry, I'm writing down. Like, where'd my pen go?
and then we have our soothing system, which is contentment, our really rest and digest.
Mhm.
And no system is bad. It's just how do we find balance? And we're in a society where thread and drive, those are you. Sometimes you might even have clients draw, where you are right now. How big are your systems? How connected are they to each other? And so often in our society, thread and drive are very big, and soothing is kind of over here,
Mhm.
and oftentimes they kind of people might bounce back and forth, like, I feel threat, let me do something. Oh, doing something put me into threat, and so now
Mhm.
we kind of a lot of CFT is let's build up the soothing system. How do we rest and digest? Which is a lot of other, modalities. It's just kind of how how CFT conceptualizes it.
Hmm.
And compassion is kind of how we move through it. So it's kind of
Hmm.
like, how do I use compassion? How do I recognize I'm in threat right now? And where do I want to get to? Maybe I do need to get to drive. Maybe I do need to go and do something. Or actually, maybe I actually really need to slow down right now. Where am I right now? And what do I need?
Hmm. Could we take like a made up clinical
Yeah.
circumstance and kind
Yeah,
of work through
sure.
the
Yeah.
systems and the compassion piece?
Yeah. So, like, let's say, for example, and so what tied to this is can be what we call our tricky brain. And so, our tricky brain says that our brain wasn't designed by us, it was designed for us. Nature created it. And so, therefore, like, no one sat down and was like, you know, pressing keys in a keyboard. Like, we just
Hmm.
went with it. And so, for example, like, let's say, your child doesn't listen to you, right? And so that puts you into anger. You go into threat, right? And so now what we're going to try and do is like we're going to try and get them to listen to us. And so
Hmm.
we might yell, and so now we're yelling, we're trying to do something, trying to achieve something. Well, now we feel anxiety because we know, like, oh, I know that really isn't the best way for me to deal with this, and so then you might think, like, oh, I'm such a bad parent. And so now you're kind of in these loops that can happen. And then the shame comes in. And so now it's like, well, I should go and get a library book on, this problem. And so now we're back to drive.
Hmm.
This moment kind of getting to soothing, taking, what, I just need a little break. The same way we would tell our kids, like, maybe you need a break, like I need a break, like I need to not keep doing. I need to actually pause and just kind of tend to myself in this moment. What's coming up for me right now? Am I tired? Am I fearful that one day my child might never listen? I have a feeling that a lot of parents worry that their kid might not ever listen. I'm not alone in this struggle. So, all the things that you would say to your friend, kind of then turning that inwards. And so, kind of soothing, being like, we call it the off ramp. Like, let's just kind of take an off ramp, take
Hmm.
it. So,
Yeah, I think about how this modality is so perfectly suited for parents because, well, for a million reasons, but one of which is like it's unrelenting. Like, there's not an opportunity to just be like, well, I'm gonna call in sick for a couple days in the way you might be able to for work if you're feeling overwhelmed. Um, it's there aren't, for many of us, there aren't other relationships that we have with people where they just pretend you didn't say a thing.
right.
So,
No, it is such a fascinating, right, dynamic. Like, this relationship is so different. And so the thesis ended up being self-compassion, and another variable, reflective functioning, is barriers to parental burnout. And so, right, as you say, parental burnout is this idea. It's different than job burnout. It's actually even more intense because at least your job, you get to, say, like, that was a hard day, but I'm just going to go home and forget it. Like, parenting, it's all 24/7. And so,
yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, it's forced resilience.
But
Hmm.
and it was funny because I tried to, the other variable included was more about like a doing action, reflective functioning. Let's be curious about what our kids are thinking. Let's, wonder. And that had no impact on parental burnout. In terms of
Hmm.
parenting when you're feeling good, like those are great skills, but like when you're feeling burnt out, self-compassion, that absolutely showed that if the higher self-compassion, the lower parental burnout, and then the inverse, the lower self-compassion, the higher parental burnout. And so
Hmm.
it's not about doing more. It's actually
Hmm.
about kind of slowing down and realizing, like, in this moment, I can't do anymore. Like, I actually need to turn inwards.
Which is fascinating given the threat and the drive, the way those function inside of us. which are telling us do more, do it faster, be more
Right.
efficient, get more done,
Right.
that's actually contraindicated.
Right.
Yeah.
I know. It feels hard sometimes to be like, I'm just gonna like stand here. I'm just gonna turn inwards.
Hmm.
But right, that ultimately like settles the system, brings things down and actually then opens because we say with threat, you're in tunnel vision. Just remove the threat. Where
Hmm.
we get to soothing, then all of a sudden we can see, oh wait, my kid isn't they don't never listen. I saw them last week listening, but when we're in
Hmm.
the threat mode, it's just like, this kind of more black and white thinking.
Right. And with our kids, most of the time, it's not a threat. Like nobody's at risk of dying. Like it's more our authority feels threatened, or we feel like we're not doing a good job and that makes us feel threatened, or we didn't like the way we just handled that and that feels threatening to our ego. And.
Yeah, and then also that future of like, what if our kid never listens?
Right.
That kind of,
Right.
yeah. You can paint the picture of them, a 25-year-old who still doesn't have listening skills and how quickly we get there.
Hmm.
So once trying to bring on that soothing helps you realize like, where are we in this moment?
Hmm.
So
Did you find in your thesis work that different age groups, like the parents of different age groups, so the older the kids, is it easier to have that self-compassion because now you've screwed up enough that you just kind of had to muddle your way to some self-compassion? How does it shift and change as the child ages?
I wish I took it further.
Uh-huh.
Didn't and I there were so many things I wanted to do. I also got to the end of I had a little self-compassion at that point. I was just like, am I weird?
Fair.
But that was definitely a topic of conversation because it's
Hmm.
the threat, in parenting feels different at different ages. Like, the motor never stops running, under 5, but
Hmm.
then as they get older, it's a different, and so, kind of different feelings of threat that happen.
Hmm.
Um, and they get very smart and they,
Hmm.
so, but yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
get a chance to look at that.
And just thinking too, as they become school aged, if you're needing to advocate for your kid with the school, like that's another level of threat that is related to them but isn't coming from them. Um, and how like nobody wants to be that mom, but also like you don't want to be a Karen, but you need to advocate for your kid, like finding that balance.
It is, and I think one of the things that I also appreciate about, I don't know if it's the modality, but sometimes this idea that we can't solve the problem overnight, that we can start to put pieces in place, but that doesn't mean, that alleviating and preventing the distress sometimes takes time to get into place. So you might see your kid is distressed at school, but you can't make a change overnight. And so it's kind of like, how do we be sensitive to the distress, sit with it, build tolerance to it,
Mhm.
knowing that we're working to make changes, but that it doesn't happen immediately.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of a conversation I just had yesterday with a friend because sometimes we perceive a threat that's not there.
Uh-huh.
Like her daughter was saying she chose to sit alone at lunch and like read a book and hang out. But like you think about like my generation and all the movies, like if you were sitting alone at the table, you were a target.
Uh,
And so like my friend was like, what can we do to support you? And she was like, Mom, I literally just needed some downtime, calm down. And
yeah.
that's like as a mom, I can relate to like that would make me very like concerned for my kid too when the kid is doing exactly what she needs and she like doesn't need our compassion, it doesn't need our threat, doesn't need our worry. Just back up. So, yeah.
Well, and which is part of the reason I love being a therapist to parents in this age group, because these kids are like, how cool that her daughter knew like
Oh
exactly what
yeah.
she needed in that moment. It's like, oh, this gives me so much hope that like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, teaching them these skills, it really does. It works, and we get to see it with the kid with kids. So,
Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah.
And then just to finish up a last core principle, which I kind of mentioned, but those three flows of compassion. And so it's compassion for others, which we tend to um, be pretty good at.
Mhm.
The compassion, although when I was thinking about this, I think the closer the person is to you, it's almost like it's a little muddled.
Mhm.
It's almost like we're better at a distance sometimes.
Yeah.
Compassion from others, which is can be hard to do as well, depending on kind of where we are, and then compassion for self.
Mhm.
And so it's, even helping clients recognize like where do you feel most comfortable? Which one feels the hardest? And so kind of using different tools for those different flows.
And I'm thinking about the compassion from others and how sometimes people aren't expressing compassion in the way we need to hear it, or we're not expressing it the way our kids need to hear it. And like, is there some dynamic to helping them voice that? Is that a part of CFT?
So that's a great question. I think it kind of leads into which kind of thinking about is that some of the one reason why is these like fears, blocks, and resistance to compassion. And so that sometimes can get in the way of why someone we're giving it and they're not receiving it, or why we're feeling like that, how it's being stated. It doesn't feel, something feels off. And so I think part of that is like a fear, like I like compassion, but I'm scared and I don't
Hmm.
know how to take it in. A lot of times with this can show up for clients in the sense that like I as a child I really wanted compassion and my parent couldn't give it to me. And instead of kind of saying, oh, because it's a child recognizing like my parent can't do this, we think compassion is the problem. Wanting compassion was the problem. And
Hmm.
therefore, when this therapist comes in and starts showing compassion, it's like, oh, no, no, no. Like, I wanted that before and that didn't work out. So, like,
Hmm.
that's the problem. And so, it's almost this like slow exposure to compassion of like, you know, not just like, kind of tiptoeing into the compassion pool for our clients.
Hmm.
The block is I'm not scared, but something gets in the way. And that happens with self compassion a lot. Like, I'm not scared of it, but I don't know how to do it. Like, there's something blocking it. There's just something. And then the resistance, which is a bit of that's like, I don't want to be self indulgent. I don't want to be weak. And so, therefore, like, I'm resisting this.
Hmm.
So if right, someone you try and give it and they resist it, it's like, oh, do you think I'm not strong enough? And that's why you're giving me compassion.
Hmm.
And so but kind of also having a conversation with someone, like what would feel good for you? Like what would feel compassionate in this moment? What, do you kind of want to hear in this moment? Can sometimes be helpful.
Yeah. So can we dive into the blocks that I don't know what's because I feel like I have heard that a lot. And I've
Uh-huh.
probably felt that a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you assess, like how you help them figure out what's blocking it, if that's important or if there's just a moving through it that needs to happen.
I think that so I tend to like I think one for me, just even hearing it when I did the training, like, oh, okay, like this is not me doing something wrong because I'm like I tried to give compassion and like it's like something wrong happened, and so I think even noting it and kind of and then kind of like two things come to mind. One, kind of having a conversation, noting it, but then also normalize and explore. Like, does it make sense that shame or, kind of resistance showed up here? And kind of helping them understand why they might, from their own experiences. Like, just does that make sense? And then could your threat system be trying to protect you right now? What might your threat system be saying that, like, with compassion in the room, what that means about you, and so kind of just being curious about it is one. Um, Two, there's tools that we can use. One of the exercises we use in CFT is like creating a ideal compassionate other. And so we kind of walk, it's almost like a meditation and walking through our clients through this kind of script. And the idea being, right, sometimes the flow to compassion in we struggle with. But if I
Hmm.
can create this ideal compassion other, because I have a flow to compassion, I had two others, right? So
Hmm.
now I'm like doing a workaround. So it's not
Hmm.
me giving myself self compassion, it's my ideal compassionate other who's giving me self compassion. And so sometimes we kind of work with it in that sense, you know.
Hmm. It's almost like a little bit of an IFS nod. Like, yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it absolutely, I did it in training and it just blew my mind. And sometimes, I imagine myself walking. There's this house. I've never seen anyone come out of it, but like I know someone lives there. It's half a block down. And I see lights on, I see flowers outside, but I've never seen anyone. And so Brenda is, and I sometimes just walk down and have a cup of tea and just kind of, Brenda helps give me the compassion I need at that moment. And so
Hmm.
imagery is a big part of CFT as well, and how we can imagine worst case scenario. So why
Boy,
also
can we. Hmm.
why don't we also imagine compassion and, different possible outcomes. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Got it. Okay. So it's okay if they can't figure it out initially.
Yeah.
Um,
And that sometimes, usually, fears and blocks and resistance would come up like kind of later. You
mhm.
might really kind of talk about it. But, as you're talking about the self critic and, kind of starting to talk about shame, but kind of for the therapist to know that, like, oh, there's some resistance here, that's a block. And that's okay. You're not
Mhm.
doing anything wrong. That's just what's coming up for the client.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about like as a parent, we're modeling compassion for our kids. They're having meltdowns, different kinds of different ages, and we are hopefully meeting them with compassion. Um, and as they get older, it's not as clean as like a tantrum when they're 3 or something, and they get it out of their system and they're done. They're more like us in that way as adults that like sometimes we get a little stuck and we keep circling a drain.
Yeah.
How do we compassionately say like, okay, like it's time to do X, Y, and Z now, like dry it up, kid, without it being, not compassionate.
Right. It is, and it is not easy. I wish
Hmm.
I, had all the answers with that. I'm currently myself listening to Dan Siegel, No Drama Discipline,
Hmm.
And so I think the trying to get at the distress, like why does it feel so hard for you? And so that kind of in that compassionate lens of like what is the distress, and it might first you're meeting with, as Dan Siegel would say, which I'm not always perfect at by any means, meeting with connection, bring the temperature down, and then trying to find out what is the distress, like why is homework just feeling like something that you just don't want to do, and so kind of trying to figure it out, like, and then being able to hopefully find a solution forward.
Hmm.
It's to me it's so often about kind of really getting to like what is it, like it's more of this overall piece, but like letting it settle, and like, kind of like a sand toy, it's like letting all the sand kind of come out and being like, okay, what's left here, what is the
Hmm. Got it. So it's being curious, guiding, like
yeah.
doing a lot of what we do as therapists, but without therapizing our kids. And
Right.
so if we're working with parents, we're helping kind of break down those steps for them of like, it's probably not actually about algebra. It's about what, yeah.
The same way a couples therapist, like it's probably not about the mug,
Right, right. Yeah.
right, it's not, what is underneath that, what is the story they're saying, um I think what's also interesting is you said though about modeling compassion. And this is where what's hard is our parents modeling self-compassion.
Hmm.
And all day tell our kids like you need to be self-compassionate, but like if I'm not doing it for myself,
Hmm.
really modeling it, you know. So that's where that like self-work comes in too, and kind of, okay, where's my distress here? My kid's really stressed about algebra. How did, you know, do I have my own sense of distress about algebra? Kind of getting curious about my own. And then how can I now show up, you know, not in threat for myself either?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I think about how we can bring our own stuff into it in a way, and some of our own unrealistic or ungrounded expectations. Like ultimately, like your kid doesn't really need to be good at algebra and they don't have to like it. They're going to have to need to do just enough to get through school, and that doesn't mean making an A necessarily.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
right, kind of what is the skill at play? Is the skill, you know, sometimes just doing things we don't want to do, you know,
Hmm.
talking about that with my daughter, that it's like, it's not about the problem on the page. This is you just building a skill, like doing things that really aren't fun. And you're not alone. Like, I have things in my day, you know, that like,
Hmm.
it's not just, you know, so that's kind of the skill here, kind of targeting, like, you know, understanding.
Hmm. And I think about how when you're not self-compassionate and your parental burnout is higher, you just could come out like you think you're the only one who doesn't have to do stuff they don't want to do.
Right, right,
Like, and there's more shame, then it's worse for everybody.
right. And then those loops keep a voice and
Hmm.
guilty, so you might withdraw. I just shouldn't even be here. Right. And so,
Yeah.
uh-huh. And so how do we take that compassionate off ramp and just be like, okay, what are all the pieces here?
Hmm. And compassion doesn't mean not having like a standard or not getting
Right,
things done. Like the homework still has to get done. You can be compassionate about the fact that they don't want to do it or that it's hard or that they don't get it.
right, absolutely. But how can we be curious, but to a place that we're still going to show up in, you know, we have a responsibility, you know, how do we find the most compassionate way to get it done? Like there isn't one way that like it has to be done at the table at this time. Let's be curious what is gonna, you know, how we can get this done. It still has to get done.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think about how like if we, sorry, that just echoed in my ear really loud. If we are concerned about like become self-indulgent and we're not holding the boundaries of like the work still needs to get done, it can suck and it's got to get done. Then um, it's like we create this cycle or this situation in which we're kind of perpetuating self-indulgence. Um, like I didn't get the part in the play I want, and I don't want to be on, so I just want to drop out even though I committed. That kind of thing of like, "God, it really sucks to show up for rehearsal. And like watch somebody else play the part you really wanted. That really, like, it really does suck. We've all been in some kind of situation like that where we wanted something bad and didn't get it and had to watch somebody else enjoy it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like,
Right.
yeah.
Think self-compassion is like almost having those examples, that again, that idea of like I'm not alone in this, like I'm not,
Hmm.
because it feels like in threat, you know, it feels like I am the only one in this. And so, right, how do we try and pull in these examples and, you know, kind of that like I had that experience too. And, you know, because our kids don't see us struggle all the time. That's part of it too. We
Hmm.
worked for how many years. And so it's like you don't know what struggle is because you have practiced for so many years. And so, kind of, almost giving opportunities to share your struggles. So it's like they, you know, or other, you know, allowing them to connect with others, but that they get those examples that they're not the only one.
Hmm. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially I think about like in early adolescence when it's so easy to feel so singled out. And like, it's gotta, you're the only weird one in this weird way when like literally everybody in your class feels that way and no one's talking about it.
Well, that's the thing. No one's talking about, and as you talk, but like, and how it shows up that like, and CFT talks a bit about this. There's a great perinatal book, and it kind of talks about this idea of like we want to be on the in group. Like evolutionarily, it makes sense to want to be in the in group because that got you resources.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that could threaten you, could put you on the out group, becomes so that much more scary because just inherently we desire. And so, right, when it's so quickly shifting in those years, it kind of leaves you in this place of threat of like, is this going to be what's going to put me on the out group? And like, and this just biological response to that because
Mm-hmm.
we inherently, it felt safer to be on the in group.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so what I started to say with the perinatal book, they kind of talk about that too, is that as new moms, where we also have that feeling of like, am I doing it right? This fear of shame,
Mm-hmm.
like, am I going to be the mom on the out group? Like, am I the one not doing it right? And that can put you in threat, but then also doesn't allow you to fully show up, and so how do
Mm-hmm.
to build that soothing system?
Yeah. And it's such a vulnerable stage of life. Like, gosh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I think there's with all parenting, right? But I'm thinking particularly with this because so many parents struggle with self-compassion. There's such a parallel process going on with like how you're parenting and how you want your kids to be giving themselves self-compassion and how you are or are not. Um, that sometimes it's like a do as I say, not as I do kind of situation.
It is. But I think it's such a joy to be, and even CFT says, even for therapists, like to be doing their if you're going to use like, and not, but like compassion, like doing your own compassion work, that
Mhm.
like, because it helps you understand it that much more and kind of be able to empathize and the struggle of applying it. But right, I think it slows things down. Like I had a moment, I remember early parenting where there's all these this kind of what rules should we follow, and like if I let my child, if I don't follow the rule once or shift it, forever, that anxious thought, and it's like,
Mhm.
okay, but those are the moments I have to turn inward, and but then that what that does model and slows things down. So it is this kind of how do we both together keep growing
Mhm.
this?
Yeah. And it's interesting, like as a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about like therapist parents. So you've got it on all these different levels, right? Um, you're responsible for modeling it all around. Um, and sometimes when you're stressed out, that's just way harder.
Yeah. But it is, so it's compassion is a motivation. And so and one of the things they said in the training, that it's self-sustaining, that if I'm motivated by compassion. And so, and they do talk a lot about how do we give ourselves, how do we, if we showed up as a perfect therapist, if we showed up as a perfect mom, we are setting our client and child up for failure because the world is not perfect.
Hmm.
Therefore, it's going to be like, wait, you failed me. Like I need to know
Hmm.
how to like have hard conversations when things don't go as, and so as a therapist being able to say like, last week when I said that, I just want to like check back in on that, and having those authentic conversation. And even as a, with kids, that idea of repair, how will, we want them to apologize, but like they need to hear it. They need to know that, they don't need to be perfect either.
Hmm.
That kind of really, which allows it to be self-sustaining. It's not like I have to show up every day and do this perfectly. I need to show up, make mistakes, and know how then to show up again. And then
Hmm.
it allows me to keep, carry that forward. It's not always perfect by any means, but it kind
Right.
of, hmm
Yeah. I'm thinking about um like the attachment
hmm
information. I went to a training once and the whole idea of like you're nailing it 30% of the time. That's not their language, it's mine.
yeah,
Um, you're nailing it 30% of the time, you're screwing up 30% of the time, and you're repairing 30% of the time. And it was so life-changing for me to hear
yeah.
that.
Oh my God. I remember where I was standing when I
Yes.
heard that in grad school, and I was like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And I was already a mom. Like I was out in the workforce. Like I had been a therapist for a long time when I heard it. And I was like, trying so hard to hit like 90% doing it right. That's what I thought was reasonable. Like I wasn't expecting perfection, just near perfection. But what that did for my own self-compassion, just having that information. And, it's all in the repair work. And so, like you're saying, you don't want to be perfect because it's setting them up for failure. That repair work is where so much healing and so much understanding of relationships and all of that comes in. And modeling that for kids gives them the opportunity to be able to like do that with friends, with peers, with teachers. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No.
So, yeah, it's a good way to like kind of combine like being let off the hook in a legitimate way. Like you don't have to do this just right.
You don't have to. And that, oftentimes I talk with clients that, they want to find the right way to do it. And I'm
Hmm.
like, we're looking for the compassionate way because the right way is a very small, if there even is, it's a dot that's so small that because it's probably not even there. Like there isn't one. And so, like, the compassionate way is like what feels aligned for you, what allows you to be able to keep showing up. And so, that so often is how can we find the compassionate way? It's like, and because we're exhausted. And so we just want someone sometimes to be like, this is what you need to do in this moment.
Hmm.
But if we ultimately like take a step back, we wouldn't be so exhausted if we potentially, in my mind, if we knew that we could show up the best of our ability and not feel this pressure to show up, do it the right, that I can
Hmm.
show up as best as I can and then I'll shift if I need to. And so then it kind of makes us not necessarily as exhausted because we know we don't have to do it just perfectly,
Hmm.
doing the best we can.
Yeah.
Hmm
Yeah. And it's like this doing the best we can. I think about the whole line of the therapists have been using forever of like your parents did the best they could. And how, I mean, not all parents do, but many do. And
Yeah.
how it kind of trains people to have some compassion for their parents' imperfections, which allows them to have more compassion for their own. Yeah.
Yeah. And two of Paul Gilbert's big lines is like one, like you didn't choose even like our react like if we yell at our kid, if I play the tape back just to be like, right, I didn't choose in that. I didn't have this conscious thought and was like, I'm gonna yell right now. That
Hmm.
and so that recognize and that also then other people weren't necessarily choosing their response, they were responding in probably a way they didn't love either, and so kind of that flow of compassion. And then
Hmm.
also says like it's not your fault but it is your responsibility, and so that's
Hmm.
that kind of accountability piece, like it's not your fault you responded that way, right? Something kind of, okay, but now it's your responsibility. And with your parents, it's not your fault your parents did what they did, but it is your responsibility. How are you going to move forward?
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, and to be able to pass that on to kids too, because that's a conversation I have a lot with one of my kids. Is like, well, she'll be like, "It's not my fault," and I'm like, "Nobody said anything about fault, baby. Like, nobody did anything malicious here, or like nobody was trying to get out of anything. Like, things just didn't go the way they were meant to go, or the way we wanted them to go. But we both have responsibility in that, and so let's figure out what our next move is." Um, and just being able to like differentiate responsibility from fault, especially for kids, because I think it feels the same for them for a long time.
Right. And it's funny, even you just saying your kid says it's not my fault, like my nervous system lower because I'm dealing with that all the time. And, this idea of as parents, us talking about, that flow of compassion, it's like,
Hmm?
okay, your kid says that too. Like, it's not just, I'm not alone. It's like the shame, went down because
Yeah.
it's a part of kids being kids. And that's where we can be so isolated. So we don't get to see other kids. And so to know,
Mhm.
like, oh, that's just a normal kid behavior
Mhm.
to say that. But right, that idea, that fault and responsibility, like and I think, kids want, that's just the way their brain thinks. But it's like having these conversations over time that it's like, we don't have to worry about fault, but right, how can we take responsibility? How can we show up and be accountable?
Mhm. Yeah. So it's interesting that like normalizing something and how powerful that can be in this model. Because like why would you feel shameful for feeling something or doing something or experiencing something that like so many other people
Right.
experience?
Yeah. But we don't
Um,
often see it. So then we just think, I
yeah.
mean, that's what I think I say more than anything. Like, it makes sense. Like, it makes
Mhm.
sense you would feel that way. And Russell Colts, he has a wonderful, he's one of CFT kind of shares a lot. He has a couple books, and he has a TED talk about anger. He does a lot of CFT and anger, and
Mhm.
but he has like this very, and he sometimes it can go very long, sometimes it's short, but it's like given your history, your brain, your childhood, your learning experience, doesn't make sense you'd struggle here. And like the answer is always yes. Like given
Mhm.
all those factors, like it makes sense that this would be an area of struggle for you. Um,
Yeah.
so
Well, and thus far we've talked about like, like things we beat ourselves up for or our kids beat themselves up for or whatever that like or as therapists we beat ourselves up for that we don't need to. Like they're normal things. And I don't think beating ourselves up does any good, but like what about when we do something wrong? Like somebody hits a kid, like slaps them across the face.
yeah.
How does CFT, like I hear some of like given your experiences, does it make sense that you went there, but how does CFT kind of work through that?
Uh-huh. And so I think it's that conversation of like, how there's distress there, right? And so how are we going to show up? How are we going to alleviate and prevent this the next time? And so really kind of, but that might be that like more holding accountable, kind of this mistake was made, but like, okay, now, and thinking about, so is this, I'm backing up. Would
Mhm.
this for working with the kid or working with
Like if you're working with the adult
the adult and the
Mhm.
kid did something?
or the parent hurt the kid, like
Oh,
in that kind of
yeah,
circumstance.
yeah. Okay. Well, in that, that there's probably going to be a lot of shame there, right?
Mhm.
And so it's kind of helping because if the parent lives in shame, they're ultimately going to struggle to show up for the kid. And so
Mhm.
it's kind of this idea of like, yes, this happened. Like, we're not going to avoid the fact, like, this happened. And how can you repair? And how can you show up? Like, what factors kind of led you to respond in this way? And I have a feeling that there's probably a lot of stressors outwardly in their life. And so we need to kind of look at what is going on, all these other stresses. What do we need to kind of like get rid of, And so kind of what is putting you into threat? And it's probably a pretty long list. Like, it's not just the kid's reaction.
Right.
Right. And so it's kind of like really getting to know what are all the threat areas. And also, how do we hold ourselves accountable but not beat ourselves up? Because that ultimately, if we want to show up better for our parent, for our child, living in shame, living in fear of being
Mhm.
that parent isn't ultimately getting us to show up better for our child.
Right.
So it's kind of like, what can I do? What self work can I do to help myself get to drive and get to soothing? Know when I'm in threat, know what my tools are to like bring that down. Um, So kind of it being like not just about that moment, but knowing that the distress is I'm not showing up the way I want to for my child. And how do I do that?
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's interesting imagining like the compassion for when somebody has done something really egregious, they still need it in order to not continue doing it.
Right. That
Hmm.
no one has ever been shamed out of a negative behavior,
Right.
and it
Right.
feels hard. It feels, that, we want people to know when they did something wrong, but also if they're now in fear, that's not, they're not gonna, their tunnel vision is still on. And so like for them, they're not going to be able to show up as compassion either.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
So let's see. What are some, we've talked a lot about modeling and like things like that, but are there some strategies
Yeah.
for modeling and like cultivating self-compassion,
Yeah.
both for ourselves and for our clients, really?
Hmm. So one of the things that I kind of this overthinking, overdoing usually means that there's some underfeeling going on. And so that is one metaphor I use a lot that I pulled from, I think it was the self-confidence CFT book, which is wonderful. And it's a pond metaphor. And it's kind of this idea that and I love it because a lot of the trainers and Paul Gilbert is English, and so you're standing in a pond in your Wellington boots, and you're trying to find something. The something might be distress or like the solution, or just you're struggling with something, and so if you start walking around, you're just going to create muck. And
Hmm.
so actually, like if you're trying to find something at the bottom of the pond, like you have to stand still. Like you kind of have to let everything settle to allow like clarity. And so sometimes I like, imagine my like with the situation, like, okay, I'm in the pond right now. Like I just have to let
Mm.
it settle. And that also, right, if I'm moving around, I'm overthinking right now. I'm overdoing. What am I not feeling? What is this underlying emotion here? And usually it's a threat emotion. What is kind of driving this, putting me into drive to try and fix, but ultimately isn't actually like getting to that core, like at what's at the core.
Hmm.
So that kind of like is just kind of a way of thinking about things. And then some tools, one of the things that using a big thing is soothing rhythm breathing that we talk about that in CFT. And I really like it because it's not, they do give numbers to it, like 4 breaths in, 4 breaths out, but then it's ultimately finding what feels rhythmic to you.
Hmm.
And like, because otherwise, like I started to realize with certain meditations, like they're kind of putting you into drive. It's like, okay, I breathe in 4, I breathe out 4. I'm achieving.
Hmm.
It's really about finding what is soothing for you. And so, like, we'll say, like, like a waves rolling in and out, but that kind of connection to self as opposed to just achieving a certain number.
Hmm.
The same thing with like a five senses meditation, but just setting a minute and kind of checking in with your different senses as opposed to like 5 things you see, 4 things you hear. Again, that's kind of putting you into drive. Where if you just
Mm.
give yourself this openness and curiosity of what am I seeing around me, checking in with those senses. So those are some tools that like allow you to get to that soothing and then choose where you want to go from there.
Yeah. It's interesting how like it sounds like so much of this model is keeping us from going back to fight or flight, where our brains are not working so well.
Absolutely. When I like laughed to myself because I would in the perinatal period go for walks in my right, thinking loops were going. And
Mm-hmm.
this is before I knew CFT. And I would do this rainbow meditation. And so I'd find things for the rainbow. And then I'd be like, I'm still thinking. And so then I would do an alphabet where I'm going to find things to go with each letter. But then I remember I like got to H and I picked something and I was like, that is not good. And I was like, this is my own exercise that I've made up. And here my critic is showing up and being like, no, 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 no. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so, right, how do we just make it, bringing everything down, that there isn't a right or wrong answer. It's just kind of engaging our senses, slowing things down, grounding our feet. But yeah, getting ourselves out of that thread and recognizing we are in the thread. We're never gonna never not go to thread. Like it makes sense. It absolutely has kept us safe,
Mm-hmm.
but how do we recognize, oh, we're there? And as you said, like, is this really a threat? And
Yeah.
how I be
Yeah.
intentional about where I go.
Mm-hmm. And I'm imagining for myself, like I like that pond metaphor of it. It might even be helpful to think about like all the things I think it is that it's not, just like settling and
Yes.
seeing what else might come up. Because I know for me, I sometimes it feels, and I know that I'm not alone in this, so I have lots of self-compassion. That like sometimes it just feels like my brain won't do it. Like I just can't. There's stuff hiding from myself, and being able to like sometimes I have to visualize certain things in order to like have other things pop up.
Right. Yeah. And that was CFT uses a lot of that, like visualization. Like we have this tool. And so another one is like a compassionate, calm place, kind of again, that like the compassionate other, but like walking people through a script and kind of what would be your compassionate, calm place and kind of what would be there? What would you be doing? What would it look like? And so, kind of in these moments, how can I go there? And then when you come back, your thoughts are a little more open and gives you a little more space.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I like it. And so rhythmic breathing, like that's like 4 in, 4 out until you like kind of find your own pace
Yeah.
or.
Yeah. So you might
Hmm.
start there. You like put on your compassionate face, which might be a smile. It's kind of what would your compassionate tone of voice sound like? It's kind of like almost putting on this like compassionate self.
Hmm.
You are to help you kind of then get in that compassionate mindset, and
Yeah.
thinking. And another exercise, and this actually, it's funny, this kind of kicked off. I was formerly a teacher and I knew I always loved psychology, and I but thought, how could I ever change, all these things. And then I remember standing there and being like, if my daughter came to me at the age I was, 35, and said, but this is what I know I want to do, like change careers, I would say to her, like, you absolutely should do it. And then I'm like,
Hmm.
if I say that to her, like I should say that to myself. And so, and I use it with clients when they're in distress. Sometimes I'm like, what would you say to your child in this moment?
Yeah.
The parenting things. And they immediately have an answer,
Hmm.
very compassionate answer, and
Yeah.
it's, helping them be like, can I say that to myself? Why does it feel hard to?
Hmm. And it's a smart way to leverage the fact that most of us are naturally more compassionate to others than ourselves.
Absolutely.
Um,
Sometimes we choose friends who also struggle with, self-compassion. So it's sometimes like I have a hard time because I'm like, well, my friends would also be like, take care of everybody else.
hmm.
But right. With my kid, I'm like, no, so,
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's kind of like a thing that we hear all the time, but like we'd never talk to anybody else the way we talk to ourselves sometimes. And like even just imagining saying any of those things to my daughters, just and I'm not somebody who's particularly hard on myself at this point in my life compared to when I was younger.
yeah. Um, I have a little story. I don't know if we have a moment, but
Yeah, yeah. And I'm gonna real quick close these blinds because there's a car and the sun is reflecting off their windshield. And despite the fact that it is bright and sunny, they've got their windshield wipers. That's what those. So anyway, go ahead. So sorry.
So during the CFT training, they had us pull up a moment of shame that we had previously experienced, and then they had us write down. So we pull it up and then write down what we say to ourselves about that moment of shame. And so the training was kind of based in the UK. It was virtual, but it was based in the UK. And so they were like, text what you wrote down to this number. And then
Mhm.
they're like, you're abroad, send the message in Zoom. And so they started, and now this training was like clinicians, these are therapists. They a lot with the National Health Service, and they read through what people said to themselves. And then it just broke your heart. Like you're in the Zoom knowing that people are, and it just was such a powerful moment to just recognize that, like, even clinician, that the self-talk is just, it can be so harsh, and it just like breaks your heart to think that people are walking around, and
Yeah.
themselves up like that. But it was such a powerful moment to be like, wow. And to then like be looking at them through Zoom, it was done very well.
Hmm. Yeah. Ugh.
So that's,
It's, I guess we're just given all that we've experienced and the ways that we're wired. Like it makes sense,
it makes
right?
sense. Right. Well, because it doesn't keep us safe to sit there and, the zebra thinking about how amazing he is while he's eating grass, that's not going to
Hmm.
keep him safe from the lion. He has to be sitting there on guard, at
Yeah.
any moment. And so that's why, it makes sense that our brains are Teflon to the positive and Velcro to the negative, because that keeps us safe. And so
Hmm.
while we know that, we now have these tools to be like, okay, this is the default.
Hmm.
I can use compassion to kind of override that system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, like, you mentioned an intervention of like, what would you tell your kid in this situation? What are some other interventions that people could use even without getting trained, maybe in CFT, but they could use in a session this afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, even, kind of just like that question of like when, a person is coming in and feeling guilty about something or their response to something, and just kind of like helping them slow down, like given your history, your brain, your learning history, does it make sense? Like, asking them that you would struggle in this moment. And
Hmm.
then kind of then asking like, and so what might you need, in this moment? How could you, what is it that you then need to help alleviate or prevent this feeling, this distress?
Hmm.
So that's as well kind of helping people kind of to bring down the nervous system, but then also start to identify like what would be what alleviates it. Um,
Yeah.
there's others, but like, kind of these, and like that, those scripts of like the compassionate calm place. And so on both the Compassionate Mind Foundation and then Balanced Minds, they give a lot of resources. And so you can pull scripts for different meditations off of there,
Hmm.
and kind of even having clients identify, what um the different flows of compassion in their day, or the past week, like when did you give yourself compassion? When did you get compassion from others? So kind of priming their mind to start picking, really kind of savoring these moments.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the balance of that, particularly for people who are in helping professions. Like if we take a therapist, for instance, and you've got a therapist who's also a parent, so there's a lot of giving compassion, and it is not the nature of the role to get compassion from your therapy clients. And depending on your kids, you might not be getting an ounce of compassion from them. How like how do you talk to your clients about finding a better balance? Because self-compassion is still not the same as compassion from others.
Mm-hmm. How do you talk to your clients about getting a better balance of,
Yeah, so that they're getting compassion from other people. Because I think even if you work really hard on self-compassion, that's still going to feel missed.
right? And it's hard because, so often it's hard to get it from your partner too, because both of you are in the trenches, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that idea of connecting to other parents, just the power in that of you just saying, my kid said, like always says it's not my fault, like just brings down that nervous system, kind of brought me out of threat in that moment. And
Mm-hmm.
so just having these as much as you can foster time to connect with other people who, and it might, it's simple little sprinklings of just like normalizing, people who are going through the same thing. And,
Mm-hmm.
parents always struggle like, but I should be with my kid. But it's like, if you're with your kid depleted, is that as good as you taking that 2 hours, connecting, receiving compassion from others, and then showing up to them with a more full cup? So,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
Yeah.
that compassion. Like, I know I need this. And it's even compassion to them because it's like, I'm not showing up for you the way I want to.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I really, it's going to feel hard for me to find the time and for me to do this, but we actually, in the short term, it feels hard, but in the long term, what it's going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think about how, like, if we open up and we're real with our friends, if we're able to make time for friends, that could also be like
Yeah.
really helpful. Because I find every time I'm like hanging out with my friends and the kids are out of earshot, like there's a lot of compassion flowing back and forth.
Right. Absolutely. Right. And it's, those and it really just like, and I think about, kind of in the evolutionary sense, like if we were, with the village, like you'd be seeing, like we'd all be together. So you'd always
Hmm.
be seeing other kids. So your kids' behavior would be normal.
Hmm.
But because we just are kind of in our silos, we don't get to see that. And I think so. The United States is the highest rate of parental burnout, which is really interesting.
Hmm.
But I think and we're also the most individualistic country.
Hmm.
Collectivistic countries actually have much lower rates of parental burnout because, they're sharing the load. They're also seeing that this behavior is normal. And
Hmm. Yeah. And I'm thinking too about how like policies get made based on what we experience in our lives. And if you don't see the entire village suffering,
yeah.
then it's just you and, who needs paid parental leave.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. And then that builds the shame. It's like, well, it must just be me.
Hmm.
That I'm the only one. How many times I'm like, I wish everyone on my couch today could have just like talked to each other because they would have
Hmm.
realized like it's not just you, but then we feel like we have to put on this face that like, oh no, everything's okay. And so, but right, being willing to have these authentic, vulnerable conversations with their friends and other parents really goes a long way.
Hmm. Absolutely. Anything else you want to leave therapists with that would be really helpful for them to be able to either go deeper on CFT or
Right.
implement some things we've talked about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I I'm trying to think. I think just, it therapists are doing a lot of compassion as it is, like it's already there. And so it's just kind of, continuing to do that, continuing to know that you don't have to be perfect because you're modeling for your clients that you don't have to be perfect. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah. I just think my brain is swirling, so giving myself
Awesome.
compassion,
Yeah, yeah, I put you on the spot. No worries. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Courtney. Genuinely, I feel like I'm taking a lot from this conversation and I'm going to use it both as a parent and a therapist. So thank you.
I am very excited because last year when I found CFT, I tried to find like I'm like I want more people to talk about CFT with because I was so excited. So it's
Yeah.
an honor to be able to share about it because it's done so much for me.
Yay. Awesome. Well, thank you. And I'll talk with you later.
Bye.
Bye. I hope that broadened your clinical horizons. Head over to notboringces.com to get your CE credit. Want to have a not boring conversation with me about your clinical area of expertise? You can apply there too. If you like this conversation, leave us a 5-star review, tell a friend, and be sure to subscribe for future conversations.